So welcome to positive economics class. Today we want to talk about demand. So what is demand? Demand is the number of units of goods a consumer wants to buy at various prices. Consumer demands goods and services to satisfy their needs. Example given, food and clothing. And wants, cars, jewelries. Utility, which is satisfaction, is the basis of all demand. So we will now take further look at this concept of demand. So what is demand? Demand is simply the total number of goods or the quantity of goods consumers, individuals are willing to buy at a given price and time. And the reason why we want to buy is to what? To derive satisfaction from our consumption. So whatever we buy, wants utility from it. That is why we're purchasing. So every individual will buy based on the assumption that all consumers are rational. They will buy because they want to enjoy the value for their money, which is utility. That takes us to the law of demand. The law of demand. The law of demand states that an increase in price leads to a decrease in quantity demanded, or a decrease in price leads to an increase in quantity demanded, vice versa. So if the price of a strawberry increased by 20% per kilogram, then the quantity demanded of strawberries purchased would fall. Also, all things being equal, ceteris paribus. So we talk about the law of demand because the law of demand simply states that there's inverse relationship between demand and the quantity, between the quantity demanded and the price of the product. So if the price of a product increases, the quantity demanded of such product is expected to fall. And on the other hand, or in contrast, if the price of a product falls, the quantity demanded is expected to rise. That is the law of demand. That takes us to consumer surplus. Why do we have consumer surplus? We have consumer surplus because that is the difference between the amount consumers are willing to pay for a product and the amount they actually paid. So let's read further. Consumer surplus is the benefit to consumers due to the difference between what consumers actually pay to consume a good and what they would have been willing to pay rather than go without the good. So for example, if you want to buy a house and have a budget of 300,000 euros, but you buy it for 280,000 euros, you have a consumer surplus of 20,000. So there's consumer surplus because that is the difference between the amount consumers are willing to pay and the amount they actually paid. So that takes us to the types of demand. We have individual demand. When we talk about individual demand, we're talking about demand that studies the quantities of goods that an individual consumer is prepared to buy at each price. So as an individual, the quantities I'm willing to buy at a particular point in time is called individual market. Then we have the market demand or aggregate demand, which combines all the individual markets together. So here I'm going to read. Aggregate demand shows the difference quantities of the good that all consumers in the market are prepared to buy at each price. So it is derived by adding together all the individual quantities demanded for the good. So we call it market demand or aggregate demand because it sums all the individual market demand. It sums all the individual markets or all the individual quantities the market is willing to sell, to buy. So consumers are willing to buy. Then we have the demand schedule. A demand schedule is a table that shows the different quantities demanded for a good at various market prices at any given time. So we have what we call the demand schedule, which is the table that shows the inverse relationship between the quantity demanded price of a product. The next one is individual demand schedule. This lists the different quantities of a good that an individual consumer is prepared to buy at each price. Then we have the market aggregate demand schedule. This lists the different quantities of a good that all consumers in the market are prepared to buy at each price. It is derived by adding together all individual demand schedules for the government. So we have individual demand schedule, which is a table that shows the relationship between the price of a product and the quantity demanded from an individual consumer. Then we have the market or aggregate demand schedule, which is the table or list that shows the different quantities of goods that all consumers in the market are prepared to pay to buy at each price. It is derived by adding together the individual demand schedule for the good. These are the types of demand we have. Then that takes us to examples. We have the example of the law of demand. So look at the table here. We have the demand schedule. As price increases, it is expected that the quantity demanded reduces. Then the sum of all demand is the total market demand. So Chris' demand, David's demand will give us the market demand for each price. That takes us to the demand curve. Demand curve is a graph representing the individual or the inverse relationship between the quantity demanded and the price of a product. At higher prices, consumers are generally willing to purchase less than at lower prices. So it means consumers will buy more when the price is lower compared to when the price is high. 2, the demand curve is said to have a negative slope, downward sloping from left to right. So there's a negative flow. There's a negative slope on the demand curve. Why? Because there's inverse relationship between price and the quantity demanded. So this is a typical demand curve for Queens and David. When the price was higher at 100, Queens buys at 5. The lower the price, the higher the quantity demanded. So as soon as the price falls to 20, the quantity demanded increases to 25. Then for David, as soon as the price falls, the quantity demanded also increases. So that is what demand is all about. The higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. The lower the price, the higher the quantity demanded. So what are the other types of demand? We have the effective demand. Why do we call it effective demand? We call it effective demand because consumers are willing to buy and are capable of buying at the price set by the supplier. So we call it effective demand because not only that consumers are willing to buy, they are capable of paying at that price. That's effective demand. Then we have derived demand. For derived demand, this occurs when one commodity is an essential part of another commodity, and it is demanded not for its own sake, but because it is required to manufacture another good. Example include timber and furniture, steel and cars. So we call it a derived demand because whatever it produces, one of those things that it produces will bring about buying other commodity. Do you get the point or not? We call it derived demand because whatever it sells, we call it derived demand because whatever the consumer are willing to buy or is willing to buy, it has to make it has to be, it has to be the reason why the demand comes in place. So if, for example, labor is a derived demand because we need labor based on the fact that labor will help us to produce goods and services. So these are all called derived demand. Then we have composite demand. Why is it composite? We call it composite demand because it occurs when the commodity is required for a number of different uses. So we call it a composite demand because the purchase or the good can serve different purposes. That is what composite demand is about. Then we have joint demand. We call it joint demand because it occurs when the demand for one commodity is joined with the demand for that commodity. Usually the commodities involved cannot be separated as a fact from a single good or can also be called complementary goods. Examples include cars and petrols, cameras and memory sticks, golf shoes, and golf balls. So we call it a joint demand because the purchase of one, the consumption of one has to be joined with the demand for another. So if we have to buy one, we have to buy the second with it. That is what we call joint demand. So why does the demand curve slope downward from left to right? The demand curve slopes downward from left to right because there is a negative relationship between price and the quantity demanded. I told you earlier that there's inverse relationship between demand and the price of a product, and that is what is happening. That is why we have the demand curve to slope downward from left to right, based on the fact that if the price is higher, the quantity demanded falls. The price falls, the quantity demanded increases. So a consumer is in equilibrium when they are following law of equimarginal returns. Talked about that previously. So there can be, now we can talk about the movement along or a shift in the demand curve. So for demand can change through movement through the demand curve or a shift in the demand curve. So a shift, a movement along the demand curve is caused by a change in the price of the good itself, and the shift in the demand curve is caused by a change in any non-price determinants of demand. So we have movement along the demand curve based on the fact that the price of the product has changed. Then we have a shift in demand curve based on the fact that other factors of production have changed over time. So that is why we call it a shift. A shift can be either right or left. So a right or shift, we're going to start with the movement along the demand curve. The movement along the demand curve is either contraction or expansion. It is contracting if the price of the product increases, the quantity demanded will fall. That is contraction. And it is expanding if the price of the product increases. If the price of the product reduces as the quantity demanded increases, that is contraction and expansion. But for a shift in demand curve, a shift in demand curve comes as a result of a change in the non-price factors. Other factors aside price that have changed over time are causes of a shift in the demand curve. So we have a rightward shifting, which represents that there is an increase in demand curve, and the leftward shifting represents a decrease in the quantity demanded. A rightward shift. If there's an increase in the quantity demanded for a good, the demand curve will shift to the right from D1 to D2. A leftward shift, if there's a decrease in the quantity demanded for a good, the demand curve will shift to the left from D1 to D2. So what are the factors that affect the demand for a good? That takes us to what we call the demand function. So we start. The first factor that determines the quantity demanded of a good is its own price. In fact, if the price of a good rises, then the quantity demanded of that good falls. That's inverse relationship. Get the point here again. Price of a product can be a determinant to the quantity demanded of a product. So if the price of a good rises, the quantity demanded of that good is going to fall. If the price of a normal good falls, then the quantity demanded will rise. So we have normal goods. These are goods that the demand for them increases as the level of income increases. So if the price of a normal goods falls, the quantity demanded would rise. So that takes us to the functions. So the first function we're going to look into is the price of other goods, which are maybe complementary goods. Complementary goods are goods that are used jointly. So the use of one involves the use of another. Example, bread and butter, cars and petrol, cameras and memory cards. So complementary goods was purchased together to satisfy their needs. So we call them complementary goods because these goods, we cannot consume them without the help of other goods. For example, like maybe bread and butter, cars and petrol. So complementary goods must be purchased together to satisfy a need or want and achieve maximum utility from the purchase. So if the price of a complementary good rises, then the quantity demanded for this fall. For example, an increase in the price of petrol will result in a decrease in the quantity demanded of high-powered cars. Since they are complementary goods, the price change of nothing, of one still. The price change of one will affect the demand for a product. So for complementary goods, if the price of one increases, the quantity demanded of the other would fall. That is a complementary good. For example, they said, look at the graphic. An increase in the price of a complementary good causes the quantity demanded for good X to fall. A fall in the price of complementary good causes the quantity demanded for good X to rise. So that is quantity demanded. That takes us to the substitute goods, which is another type of goods. Substitute goods are goods that satisfy the same needs and thus can be considered as alternatives to each other. Examples of substitute goods include butter and low-fat spread and different brands. For example, so we see, for some, okay, let's see. Example of a substitute good they said here, coffee, milk, milk and breakfast cereals, brands of tea. They are all substitutes because one can, they are substitutes good because the consumption of one might reduce the consumption of another. So these goods are goods that can replace each other. So let's put it that way. These are goods that can replace each other. So if an increase in the price of one good leads to an increase in the quantity demanded of another goods, that's as an alternative. The two goods are said to be what? Substitute. So they are also substitute goods because an increase in the price of one might bring about a fall or a rise in the quantity demanded of another if the price of the other good does not change. Another factor that determines the quantity demanded of a good is the level of income. As consumer income rises, the quantity demanded of normal goods increases. As income falls, the quantity demanded of normal goods falls. That's a positive income effect. So there's a positive income effect if the level of income increases, and as a result of that, the quantity demanded of a good increases. That's a positive effect, a positive income effect. Then, for normal goods are goods that obey the law of demand and has a positive income effect. A rise in income causes more of these goods to be demanded, while a fall in income leads to a lower quantity of these goods being purchased. The price effect implies that as price increases, the quantity demanded decreases. So we call it a normal good because as soon as the level of income increases, the quantity demanded for such goods reduces. And as soon as the income falls, the quantity demanded for such goods. As soon as income increases, the quantity demanded for such goods increases. As soon as the level of income falls, the quantity demanded for such goods falls. That's why there's what we call it a positive relationship between the demand for the goods and the income. For inferior goods are goods with a negative income effect. So as soon as income increases for such goods, the quantity demanded for the goods reduces. As soon as income falls, the quantity demanded for such goods increases. So there's a negative income effect for inferior goods. And what are inferior goods? Like I said earlier, inferior goods are goods that the consumption reduces when the income level increases, or the consumption falls when the income level rises. So the demand for inferior goods will fall from D1 to D2 if the income level increases. And the quantity demanded for such goods increases from D1 to D2 if the income level falls. So another factor that could determine the quantity demanded of a product is consumers' expectation. And when we talk about consumers' expectation, we're talking about the price or availability of the good at some stage in the future can affect the quantity demanded for the good. If a consumer expects that the future prices are likely to be greater than they are now, then there may be an increase in the quantity demanded for the good at each price. For example, the price of oil, share prices in the stock market, the price of gold. So consumers' expectation can also determine if the demand for a good increases or fall. So if consumers are expecting that the price of the product will rise in the future, they tend to buy more. So the quantity demanded for now will increase because it is expected that price will rise in the future. And if it is expected that the price of the product will fall in the future, the demand for such products will fall at the present situation. So the quantity demanded for good will increase and the curve will shift to the right if consumer expects the price of good eggs to be higher in the future than the scarcity of good eggs in the future. So we have a rightward shift in the demand curve if it is expected that the price will rise in the future. Then we have a leftward shift we have a leftward shift in the demand curve, which is expected that the price if it's expected that the price will fall in the future. Consumer taste. Goods may become less or more appealing to consumers with the passing of time. As the person's taste is constantly changing, some goods that were very much in demand in the past have now gone out of fashion completely. For example, very few people rent DVDs anymore, and DVD rental shops have disappeared from the high street because people download movies from the internet or use live streaming services such as Netflix instead. So if there's a change in taste or preferences in favor of the good, it causes an increase in the quantity demanded, which shifts the demand curve to the right. If there's a change in the taste or preferences against the good, it causes a fall in the quantity demanded, which shifts the demand curve to the left. Advertising tries to influence taste in favor of the good. So, taste and preferences can also bring about a rightward shift in the demand curve or a leftward shift in the demand curve. So, a rightward shift in the demand curve could be as a result of consumer taste and preferences. So, if consumer taste and preferences is in favor of a product, then the demand curve for such product will have a rightward shift. It will shift from D1 to D2. There will be a rightward shift because the demand for such product, based on the fact that another factor that could shift the demand curve of a product is consumer taste and preferences. So if there's a positive impact on consumer taste and preferences, it will shift the demand curve for a product rightward from D1 to D2. On the other hand, if there's a negative impact on the consumer taste on the product, if the demand for a product is having a negative impact in terms of taste and preferences, the demand curve for such product will shift leftward from D1 to D2. So an advertising campaign can also bring about that. With a favorable advertising campaign, we shift the demand curve rightward from D1 to D2. Another factor that could shift the demand curve rightward is unplanned factors. Sometimes the change in the quantity demanded for a product cannot be anticipated. So if there's a sudden heat wave, which would be an unplanned factor, there will be an increase in the quantity demanded for sunscreen and a decrease in the quantity demanded for home heating oil. So unplanned factors can also change the demand curve. So if unforeseen circumstances, things happen, and it is unfavorable for the product, the demand for the product will rise. Government regulations. Government can introduce new legislation that affect consumers' demand for goods and services. So these laws can cause an increase or decrease in the quantity demand. If the government initiates a program that is aimed at increasing the consumption of a product, then the quantity demand for this product will increase, shifting it to the right. Well, on the other hand, the government implements a program that is aimed at reducing the consumption of a product, the demand curve for such product will reduce and shift the demand curve leftward. So what are exceptions to the law of demand? The exceptions to the law of demand are on some certain goods, like given goods. Given goods are goods with a positive price effect. So in essence, more is bought as the price rises and less is bought as the price falls. There are some exceptions to the law of demand. Example of the exception are goods that have, that increases, that their demand increases when the price increases, and the demand for such goods falls when the price falls. Even if, for example, price of a bread, if the price of bread increases, the demand for bread will also increase. Status symbol, snob items, ostentatious goods, and goods of conspicuous consumption. Some commodities are attractive to some buyers because of their exclusiveness or high price. So a rise in price makes them more exclusive and therefore more attractive to consumers to buy. So another factor is people buying based on consumption or conspicuous consumption or based on status. So some people would buy a product based on the fact that the price continues to rise over time because it increases or they want to prove a point based on their status. Goods influenced by consumer expectation and speculative goods. If prospective buyers think that the prices are likely to be higher in the future in comparison to current prices, the current level of quantity demanded may not fall, even if price increases slightly. So these are also another exemption. So consumers might be influenced based on expectation of speculations in the future. Another exemption is addiction. Consumers might be addicted to certain products. So whatever happens to the price, consumers will continue to buy. So what are the causes of an increase in quantity demanded? A decrease in the price of goods itself will bring about an increase in quantity demanded. An increase in the price of a substitute good will bring about an increase in quantity demanded. A fall in the price of a complementary good will also increase the quantity demanded of a product, because complementary goods are goods that are jointly used. An increase in income increase the demand for a normal good. Expectation of higher prices or scarcity in the future will bring about an increase in the quantity demanded. A change in taste in favor of the good will bring about an increase in the quantity demanded. Favorable unplanned factors will also bring about an increase in quantity demanded. Government legislation influencing an increase in consumption will bring about an increase in the quantity demanded. So what are the cases of that will bring about a fall in the quantity demanded? A price of substitute, the price of price of substitute, an increase in price, a pay rise will reduce the quantity demanded of inferior goods, and so on. So this ends demand. So in the next class, we're going to talk about supply. Thank you.